Hello, and welcome to my YouTube channel, Reading Little Blue Books, out loud, while stoned. In this video, we're going to do part 3 of Little Blue Book, number 1060, titled The Futility of Belief in God, written by Joseph McCabe, copyright 1926, 1926. In this video, it'll be the final video. We're going to do chapters 5, 6, and 7. And chapter 7 is just like 2 pages long, so it won't be that bad. But we'll start off with chapter 5, which will be the religious instinct. Chapter 6 is a chapter of disproofs, and chapter 7 is the conclusion. So let's start off here, page 42. Page 42, where are you? There we go. There we go. Page 42. Alrighty, here we go. Chapter 5, The Religious Instinct. What we have seen in the last chapter applies to every attempt to create a belief in God for practical purposes. This was admirably illustrated in the effort of H.G. Wells to establish a new conception of God a few years ago. It failed completely. Well, Wells had come to the conclusion that while the world will certainly remain democratic in the political sense, progress is bound to come from a sort of aristocracy, a union of the best men and women in each country. He then imagined that these select companies would do well to have an ideal leader, and he conceived this as God the Invisible King. He made very little attempt to prove that this invisible king really existed. It was rather an ideal, a personification of law and duty. But I never heard of a single convert to the new religion, though its author is one of the cleverest and most influential writers in England. God is not wanted by our generation. It is just as futile for our philosophers to imagine that, when they have shattered the basis of the popular argument for God, they can provide the masses of the people with new arguments or new conceptions of God. As I have said, hardly any thinker of our time believes any longer in the personal deity of the churches. None accepts the common argument for God. But a large number of our philosophers believe in a God, and some of them seem to think that they may communicate their belief to people who are not philosophers. They certainly will not, and therefore I do not propose to examine their ideas here. They are divided into 2 antagonistic schools. One school follows the German philosopher Hegel, and believes in a very abstract and impersonal God, without recognizable characteristics, which they call the Absolute. It takes a large volume even to explain what they mean. On the general public, the philosophy, as a critic said long ago, makes much the same impression as an elephant which is introduced to a nation which never saw one before. People are not sure which is the head and which is the tail. The other school of philosophers, mainly an estimable group of professors at Oxford University, who are far out of touch with the world as professors generally are, call themselves personal idealists. They believe in a personal God, and they find evidence for him in the mind of man and its ideals. The argument is very strained and almost as difficult to follow as the preceding. Evolution explains man's ideals without any metaphysics of this kind. Then there is the very small school, which is known in America as pragmatists, and in England as humanists, and has no influence in either country. It is not the aim of this school to prove the existence of God, but some religious writers regard it as favorable to them, because it does not admit the supremacy of human reason. Our belief, it says, are due to reason alone. Our whole nature, even our needs and interests, enter into them. That is largely true, but clearly, Beliefs formed in this way are more likely to be false than true. The theory does not help any man who wants to be sure that God really exists. At the most, it may approve of God in a belief. Belief in a God is useful. I am concerned with those who regard it as true. It is of no use unless it is true. No one would expect me, in so tiny a work as this, to give a satisfactory account of these new religious philosophies, but I give the reader just this word about them for two reasons. First, very few of these philosophers accept the personal God of the creeds, and it is quite wrong to represent them as doing so. Secondly, none of these philosophers, that is, remember, our most profound thinkers, admits any value in the only arguments for the existence of God which circulate amongst the general public. The believer ought to understand that clearly philosophy is as much against him as is science or history. We'll pause there for hydration. Hydrate, Maddie. Getting cotton mouth right out the gate. But I am mainly concerned in this chapter with an argument which is supposed to be philosophical in form, yet is used in popular literature. It is said that no matter how little trace of God there is in the external world, man has a religious sense or instinct which bears witness to him. This argument used to be put, and is still sometimes put, in the form of a unanimous testimony of the human race to the existence of God. All peoples that exist or have ever existed, it is said, believe in God. What that would prove, if it were true, is not very clear. The whole human race has until modern times been wrong on hundreds of things. One would almost say wrong on all things, except those which are quite obvious. Moreover, nearly the whole of the race believes in God, as I have now shown, for false reasons. Finally, it is not true that all peoples believe in God. I show this in The Origin of Religion, Little Blue Book, number 1008. The lower peoples do not believe in God. The belief evolves before our eyes, and now, in the highest peoples, it is disappearing before our eyes. This supposed consent of the whole human race is a myth, and the inference from it is ridiculous. Well, the new apologists say, let us take the belief in God as it actually exists. It is so widespread, so nearly universal, that there must be some instinct or special religious sense in man for perceiving the existence of God. Just as one part of a man perceives color, another hears sounds, and other feels heat or cold, so there may be a spiritual faculty for perceiving God. We may feel his presence, not infer it from nature, and many believers say that this is their experience. You've got an itch. In view of the collapse of all the arguments for God from an external world, there is naturally a tendency to concentrate on and develop this argument. It seems safe against any advance of science. You know more about... Let me see. You know more... Turning the page. You know more about your own consciousness, you think, than the man of science does. If you feel the existence of God, how can a man of science tell you that you don't? It sounds very simple and promising, but it leads to nothing. The first difficulty is that the strength of this instinct has a remarkable relation to the degree of a man's education. Belief is strongest where education is poorest. In the better educated middle class, the majority of the men have no such inner sense or belief in God. The women, who are less educated, have more religion. But the modern woman, who is getting equal education, is becoming as irreligious as man. In the circles of highest culture, of science and philosophy, the belief is feeblest of all. Strange, isn't it? that if God has implanted a religious instinct, a sense of his presence in the breast of man, it should grow feebler in proportion as the head is enlightened, and should generally disappear when the knowledge is greatest? Most of us, when we were young, had this religious sense. In proportion as we grow in wisdom, it fades out of existence. I have not an atom of this religious instinct today. Why have you? 2/3 of the leading men of science and historians do not believe in God. 2/3 of the younger pupils of their colleges do. Why is the religious sense distributed in this curious way? No one surely will suggest that the elderly professors are so dissipated that the internal mirror of their religious sense is tarnished, and the young undergraduates are so refined and virtuous that in them the mirror is spotless and bright. I really cannot help being a little sarcastic at times while I write on some of these arguments for the existence of God. Perhaps you think that I misunderstand or misrepresent the argument. Certainly not. Learned clergymen, amongst whom I have many friends, assure me that they rely no longer on arguments from design and first cause and so on. They appeal to the inner religious sense or instinct. You can read this in any quite modern religious work. And this religious sense, that is to say, the belief in God which expresses it, is certainly distributed in the curious way I have described. The more educated we are, the higher the proportion of unbelievers. The more the world grows in wisdom, the less belief in God there is. It is surely plain that this so-called religious sense is, like conscience, an outcome of education and environment. There are 4 faculties or powers or senses or instincts in man, from which one or other theologian have tried to deduce the existence of God. They are the intellectual, the moral, the religious, and the aesthetic faculty. Let me note in passing that in modern psychology, the idea of special faculties or powers or instincts is not recognized. There are only abstract ways of regarding the mind. However, let us take the 4 faculties, insofar as they are claimed to be spiritual realities, and therefore to indicate the existence of a spirit world. We must, as I turn the page, oops, one too many. We must, as I said, postpone the question. It will be discussed in other volumes. In regard to the intellect, some say that as the universe is rational and can be understood by the mind, there must be a rationality, an arrangement of mind in the universe itself. Bishop Gore repeats this in his recent book, Belief in God. The book, by the way, is only one more illustration of the desperate condition in our time of the belief in God. Gore is so overwhelmed by the growth of skepticism that he declares that the belief is dead, and he sees no immediate prospect of its revival. In the face of this dark situation, as it must seem to him, his book is really frivolous. Of its 400 pages, only about 20 are devoted to an effort to prove the existence of God. I say that this is frivolous, but the real reason is clear enough. There is no new argument for God, and Gore seems to feel that the old arguments have now little force. He might at least have chosen some argument more plausible than this from the rationality of the universe. Its laws are, as I explained, merely man's way of summing up its behavior. Its regularity of conduct is just what we expect of a being without mind or will. Its order is an outcome of an evolution which we have fairly traced. In the human mind, and whatever minds there are on other planets, were blotted out tomorrow, there is no sense whatever in which the universe could be described as rational. As to Man's aesthetic sense, or sense of beauty, on which Lord Balfour builds an ingenious and amusing argument for the existence of God. It is one of the most clearly evolved of man's faculties. It is a higher degree of the dim sense of ornamentation in the blurred mind of the bower bird. It emerged from the nebulous material of life or mind, and it will pass away with the last dwellers of the earth. It points to nothing beyond itself. So it is with the moral sense, as I have shown, and the religious sense. It is only the general collapse of the familiar arguments which have sustained faith in God for 2,000 years that explains these strained efforts to find supernatural meanings in natural things. Pardon me. Indeed, the argument from a religious sense is even feebler than that from a moral sense. We all have a moral sense, a perception of moral distinctions and obligation, and it generally grows from one's progress in knowledge and refinement. It is just the reverse with this supposed religious sense. It decreases with knowledge and generally with refinement. The truth is that there is no religious sense or instinct. The idea that man is eternally religious, that the child naturally develops a sentiment of religion, is against the entire experience of our age. In spite of the efforts of hundreds of thousands of ministers of religion and wealthy clerical organizations, religion is disappearing. If knowledge is light, as we commonly say, one is inclined to regard religion as darkness. When one notices how consistently the advance of the one means the disappearance of the other, the believer in God ought easily to understand. You're turning pages? Yep. Ought easily to understand why so many are now disposed to regard preachers and religious writers as not honest. They constantly use arguments which have been long discredited and are not true to the facts of life. They talk of man as eternally religious, while they see the educated modern world surrendering religion on a phenomenal scale and refusing to accept the new religions or versions of religion that arise. Modernism does not appeal to the world in spite of all the ability and energy of its apostles. The cities of the world have done with religion. The villages will have done with it tomorrow. The claim of a religious sense is a flagrant defiance of notorious facts. Boy, I wish he was right. He would hate the future today. Anyhow, as to children, in whom this religious sense is supposed to dawn, the statement is easily tested. I say, modern psychologists say, that what is called religious sense is a set of ideals and emotions implanted by education. Well, take children in different environments, without religion, with little religion, and with fervent religion. The children develop religion precisely in proportion to their environment and teaching. My 4 children, who were taught neither religion nor anti-religion, never showed the least inclination to believe. It is the consistent experience of agnostic families. If, in fine, you want further proof, reflect on the infinite contradictions of this religious sense in different individuals. It tells a different story in all the 300 religions of the world, even in one sect. Says the Episcopal Church, it inspires 20 different versions, even of the nature of God. It gives one a Jehovah with an eternal hell, another a merciful Father, another simply a creator, another a spirit of the eternal universe, and so on. Religious ideas and emotions are plainly the result of education and environment. There is no religious instinct. There is, in fact, no such thing as instinct. The last prop of faith collapses. 2,000 years of industry in fabricating proofs of the existence of God have ended in bankruptcy. What the ordinary believer takes for granted or regards as demonstrated beyond the shadow of a doubt, the existence of God, has proved an insoluble problem. though the greatest minds of the race have until recent times devoted their genius to it. That is the end of chapter 5. And we'll move on here after I pause for hydration, to chapter 6. Okay, chapter 6. A chapter of disproofs. Must we then be atheists? It depends on what you mean by the word. Most people who do not believe in God, and there are millions of such in any modern civilization, if they are not the majority, do not call themselves atheists. The word is taken to mean a denial of the existence of God, and most of us do not care to deny the existence of anything simply because it is not proved. I do. I consider myself an atheist. The few who call themselves atheists, however, say that they merely mean that they have no belief in God. Agnostics, they say, are cowards who are afraid of the popular prejudice against atheism. It's true. They quote a German philosopher who said that an agnostic is an atheist in a silk hat. Atheist is from the Greek words a and theos, or God. And the letter A is sometimes said to be privative, not negative. They do not deny, but they do not accept the existence of God. Unfortunately, the Greek particle a may be either negative or privative. And from the days when the word atheist was first coined, it has meant, in the minds of the great mass of mankind, one who denies the existence of God. So I do not use it. I cannot prove a negative. The word agnostic, one who does not know, that the human mind is so constituted that it cannot know, that is a theory, and I do not share it. I mean, in calling myself agnostic, simply that the existence of God, any God, is not proved. And to finish with these definitions of terms, a theist is anyone who believes in God. A deist is one who believes in God and rejects revelation. And a pantheist is one who believes that God is not a separate reality from the universe. But it must be clearly understood when we use the word agnostic, that what we do not mean that it is quite an open question whether there is a God or not. Okay, let me read that again. But it must be clearly understood that when we use the word agnostic, that we do not mean that it is quite an open question whether there is a God or not. Okay, never mind. There is no respectable evidence whatever for God, and there is a mass of evidence which disposes us to believe that there is no God. The case for theism is very feeble. The case for atheism is very strong. It still is. Let us, so to say, put all the evidence on this great question in two scales. Let us imagine God, if you like, using a divine balance to weigh the evidence for and against his existence, as it is found in the minds of men after 2,000 years of controversy. In one scale, he puts all the affirmative arguments. He drops in with a smile the ancient arguments of Plato and Socrates and Aristotle. He adds the antiquated arguments of the Christian fathers and schoolmen, of St. Augustine and St. Anselm, St. Thomas and St. Bonaventure. Still smiling, he throws in the arguments of the deists of Paley, of Kant, of Fiske, of Krall, of all the poets and philosophers of the 19th century. And I imagine that he still smiles when he finally puts in the arguments of Professor Bergson and Professor Eucken, and of the absolute idealists and the personal idealists of Calvin and Lodge, of Osborne and Milton. There is not much in the crowded scale except mutual contradictions. What is there for the other scale? All the tears and blood that these poor children of men have ever shed, all the pain and disease and suffering that have darkened this planet, all the brutality and injustice ever perpetrated, all the blunders and crimes that wisdom might have prevented. The modernist preacher and the religious scientist say sometimes that evolution is a more impressive revelation of God's power and glory than creation. How soothing nice phrases can be. You will admit that the earth today looks rather godless. I have lately seen the poor shivering in the zero weather of Chicago and Minneapolis and Winnipeg. I have seen the seamy side of life in San Francisco and Los Angeles. I have seen the poor of Mexico wrestling a pittance from the soil and shuddering under a threat of a new revolution. I read of impending war between Chile and Peru. I hear of Europe still laboring in the heavy seas of post-war time and meditating new wars. I glance with pity and wonder at the daily news sheet of crime, brutality, death, suffering, stupidity, hatred, exploitation, privation, and indifference. If I were God, it is bad enough. But I know history, and I know that it is better today than it ever was before. 6,000 years of tears and blood, that was bad enough. It has left us a legacy of violence and stupidity that we shall take time to erase. And now, it seems, it was not 6,000 years, but at least 6 million years of human life at the lowest and most brutal level. And before that, 600 million years to count only from the dawn of consciousness of animal savagery. This is supposed to be a grander revelation of God than if the carnage had lasted only 6,000 years. And the machinery designed to effect this evolution from this new theistic point of view is not less revolting. There is no law of evolution. Living things do not go on evolving if you leave them alone. They change little as long as they remain happily adapted to their environment. In my debates with the leaders of fundamentalists, I was amused when they quoted as evidence against evolution the fact that large classes of animals make no progress whatever. Of course not. Why should they? They are adapted to their environment. They change only when there is some stimulating change in their surroundings. New enemies, new parasites, new dangers, new catastrophes, fresh pain, and blood and death. Great changes of climate, ice ages, have been a most important part of the machinery of evolution. They led to very great advances and, incidentally, they caused prodigious suffering and slaughter. One of the religious scientists of America, there are 15, I believe, has written a learned book on the microscopic animals on which he is an authority. Because the organs of some of them are very ingeniously constructed, he puts on the title page of his book an old German motto, which I may translate. Got an itch. And before I do that, I'm going to hydrate. Because cotton mouth is no fun. Okay, here's the translation. Peruse this book, and from it see God's greatness in all things that be. And amongst the things, which he then describes, are the germs of all sorts of loathsome and frightful diseases, syphilis, typhus, tuberculosis, etc., and other parasites. How God must have smiled. I do not know how many thousand types of parasites and carnivores there are in nature. I am at the moment 1,000 miles out at sea. Not really. But does that number matter? From pole to equator, every living thing has innumerable parasitic and carnivorous enemies. The earth is, and has been for hundreds of millions of years, a battlefield. Such is the carnage, even in modern times, that I have lately heard a surgeon claim that during those 4 terrible years in Europe, 1914 to 1918, more lives were saved compared with previous years than were wasted on the battlefields. And we are now humane. We humans have improved the scheme of creation or creative evolution. 100 years ago, more than 1/2 of the babes which mothers brought into the world in pain and travail never reached the age of 20. Before that, it was even worse. It took the human population of a country 4 centuries to double. Now, it would, if there were no birth control, double in a quarter of a century. Yes, you know it, you say. It has troubled religious thinkers ever since the doctrine of an infinitely powerful God was formulated. Hardly a single great Christian writer has failed to confront this problem of the existence of evil. Very good. What have they said about it? Can you recall any serious solution of it that you ever heard? Suffering chastens the soul and improves character, say some. Is that your experience? In very few cases indeed of the millions of human beings does pain or affliction ever improve character. The excuse is frivolous. But if we bear our cross properly, there is heaven for us, you say. Again, to what proportion of the human race does that apply? If the idea of heaven is an illusion, as I prove in another little blue book, the entire argument is vicious. But even if there were a heaven, the excuse would cover only a small part of the pain of the world. It does not touch the entire animal world. Why were they created at all, if it be a necessity of their lives that hunger shall drive them to seek food, and that 1/2 shall hunt and rend and devour the other half? Moreover, the argument does not even apply to the human family. If the accepted version of the conditions of admission into heaven be true, the part of the race which suffers most, the majority, will never enter heaven. Of all the men who lived before Christ during many millions of years, you will expect to meet very few in paradise. And their brothers, the lower races of today, will not be more fortunate. Of the civilized nations of today, the least religious are the poorer workers of our cities, and it is they who suffer most. The elect, who will wear crowns, are oil magnates and stock dealers who gave millions for clerical charities. The comfortable dames of Fifth Avenue, turning page, the sheltered and not ill-fed clergy, and so on. Suffering does not generally purchase heaven. It is usually a foretaste of hell. What other justification of the ways of God will you attempt? Nothing new has been discovered since the days of Job. It is a mystery. Yes, it is a mystery if you believe in God. It is no mystery in our modern philosophy of life. Nature is unconscious. Out of its dark womb, a full glow of consciousness at last emerges, and living things begin to suffer. But Mother Nature knows nothing of their sufferings. At last, man appears. Still, for millions of years, he does not differ essentially from other animals. He has no large plans. He knows little of the world about him. He foresees no future. At last, self-conscious, civilized man appears, and science is evolved. Then, with a fire of idealism in his heart, with the great powers of the material world at his service, he begins to right the wrongs and blunders which are a legacy from the less wise past. Is that philosophy not true to the facts of life as you know them? The only excuse for God is that he does not exist, said a witty and wicked Frenchman in the last century. In a sense, Henry Belay's stinging phrase is a platitude. If God did exist, could you find an excuse for him? No one has yet done it. But they are trying again, and we must consider what they say. How one grows weary of following these changes of religious thought and argument, the supposed constant changes of science, which are really, for the most part, developments of what we already know, are slight in comparison with the changes in theology, and science claims no divine inspirer who might be assumed to have an interest in guarding the race from error. The latest plea is that, after all, perhaps God is not infinite in power. Perhaps there are limits to what he can do. Perhaps he could not prevent the pain and evil in the world. We save his benevolence at the cost of his omnipotence. Do we? The truth is that this theory, which was adopted by John Stuart Mill long ago, and is now favored by Sir Oliver Lodge and others, leaves us in a state of mind of the utmost confusion. What proof do you offer of the existence of this finite God? English wits call it, when Mill introduced it, a limited liability God. I like that one. The order and purposefulness of the universe as usual. The finite God, if not the creator, at least the designer of the universe. The mind guiding the forces of nature. Very well. Then he directed the forces of life to produce the germs of typhus and cholera, the teeth of Macadurius, the saber-toothed tiger. I probably pronounced that incorrectly. And of the 20-foot sharks of long ago, the lust for blood of the lion and the wolf, the spider and the serpent. If he did not, why do you claim that he paints the sunset and the orchid, shapes the beautiful shell, or fashions the human eye? You want to leave the simplest microbes, when they are pernicious, entirely out of the list of things which he guided the forces of nature to produce, and include in the list the fashioning of such complex things as the human brain and heart. Nay, you want to ascribe to your finite God all the good impulses of the mind and heart, and leave all the bad impulses as things which his limited power could not control. Certainly a naive proposal to make to us. It is like saying that all the good things in nature clearly require an intelligent principle to explain them, and all the evil things, which are just as intricate, do not require one. But perhaps you would like to help out the argument with the hackneyed phrase that evil is only negative. So when your nerves tingle with the pain of a toothache or headache or appendicitis, the sensation is merely the absence of good. The teeth and claws of the lion are as negative as the pain of the deer. Perhaps the toxins which poisonous microbes put in the blood are negative, and, of course, death is only the cessation of life. Poverty is only the absence of wealth, and so on. Try again, my friend. I feel sure that you have a heart. Face the facts candidly. This world contains a mass of evidence that it was probably not designed by God, and there is no serious evidence that it was. But here is another new apology for God, and it is very proud of itself because it is actually based upon evolution. We admit, it says, that there have been hundreds of millions of years of pain and brutality. We admit that the finger of God is not very obvious in the world today. But a brighter age is coming. A far higher race and better earth will yet appear. The dark tragedy of the past will be crowned by a glorious final scene. Yes, I believe it. On evolutionary principles, it is certain. We are only just learning the elements of civilization. We shall rise as high above the life of today as it is above the life of the ape. But the idea that a few million years of happiness at the close justifies a process of evolution, if that was consciously guided, which entailed hundreds of millions of years of misery for beings that die before the happiness begins, is one of the most flagrant applications I ever read of the pernicious principle that the end justifies the means. An English writer, H. Malik, damned this argument 20 years ago. Whatever he, God's future, we shall never forget his past, he said. Let us take it soberly. There seems to be nothing in the whole of nature which now seriously persuades us to believe that a God must have made it. Our telescopes sweep out over 1,000,000 billion miles of space, and we find no more evidence than we do about us. On the other hand, there is a vast amount in nature that favors atheism. It is the same with man. Nothing in his nature compels us to assume that the evolutionary agencies which developed him were guided. His imperfections, his age-long brutality, suggest that they were not guided. It is the same with his history. There is no finger of God in it from the first page to the last. His blundering, evolving intelligence and ideals account for everything, the good and the evil. In the long, torturous, blood-stained process of the evolution of his religions, there is no more trace of divine wisdom than elsewhere. That is the end of chapter 6. And we'll pause for a moment. Okay, here we go. Final chapter, chapter 7, conclusion. Clemencia, in one of his essays, has a fine imaginary description of the mourning of nature at the news of the death of Pan, the Greek god of nature. At last, the God of nature and of man is really dying. The gods die, but God remains, said a liberal preacher. It is another instance of the seduction of rhetorical phrases. The God of this preacher, a very liberal version of the Christian God, is dying like all the dynasties of gods that ruled before him. A God of kindred seed and line, man's giant shadow held divine. The poet, who thus complacently saw the passing of the Christian God, Sir W. Watson, had a God of his own, an unknown God. This was to remain. Every new God is going to remain, and they all pass. The belief in any kind of God is disappearing. That is the summary and exact historical language of what has happened in the last 100 years. And neither nature nor man mourns. From all over the world, people tell me that my books are largely responsible for their loss of belief in God. And not one of them but expresses pleasure that he has ceased to cherish an illusion. The millions of our cities shut God out of their lives and thoughts, and with such lightheartedness that they are not quite sure whether they believe in his existence or not. They never think about him. There is mourning, it is true. It is confined to the clergy and religious writers. Great is the Diana of the Ephesians. It is not my wish to try to ascertain how far the clergy themselves believe in the God whose death they deplore. Very large numbers of them notoriously do not. An elderly clergyman of the Church of England deliberately assures me that a very large part of the clergy of the Church of England are agnostics. It is the same of the Church of Rome and all the churches. Yet the clergy naturally deplore the passing of the belief in God. No one will mind their tears if they do not give wrong reasons for them. When they urge that the world will become dark and chaotic, that all life will become a gladiatorial arena, that women and children will no longer be able to venture out of doors, they say things which are clearly false and insincere. Their godless age is far better for women and children than any age that ever preceded it, but especially better than the long Christian era which is closing. You may see all this in detail elsewhere. I close with a broader view. Some recent apologist for God has said that, apart from details of conduct, life generally will lose its color, its definiteness, its charts, if the belief in God passes away. There will be no purpose in human life, no meaning in all its existence. We have been familiar with this kind of pessimism ever since the days when that strange artist Leo Tolstoy first wrote it. It is essentially the impression of a morbid artist. Existence will not have a meaning, you say. What a pity for the philosophers. Who else cares? Do you need a meaning in the universe at large to be keen and honest in your business and wise and kindly in your home? There is no goal, no purpose in life, you say. It was brilliant and beautiful, was it not, in the days until the 19th century, when men saw its purpose in the will of God? But at least, you say, man has stars by which to chart his course in those days. You have blotted the stars out of its firmament, and now, my friend, we have put other stars there, and we move across the sea of life more swiftly, more confidently, more smoothly. That is not rhetoric, it is fact. We are not yet all agreed on our course, yet we advance wonderfully. When all are agreed, when human ideals shine from the sky instead of ancient illusions, when we have done entirely with the service of God, which has wasted the resources of the race for tens of thousands of years, and devote ourselves to the service of man, this tired earth will flower like the meadow in the spring, and the sun will shine on more hearts of men than it ever warmed before. That is the end of Little Blue Book number 1060, titled The Futility of Belief in God, written by Joseph McCabe, copyright 1926. Thanks for listening, and join me in the next Little Blue Book.